They say you can tell a civilization's values by what they're willing to kill for. The ancient Slavs, they killed for shadow, literal shadow. Every eclipse, solar or lunar, brought a celebration so drenched in blood, you'd think the sun had dipped too close, just to escape it. And at the centre of it all stood a thing that shouldn't have existed. A temple built from skulls. Not metaphorically, not decoratively, functionally. Skull walls, skull towers, and in the middle, an altar so darkly stained, the stone wept iron when it rained. The priests called themselves Volkhvi, keepers of the path, stewards of harmony, and occasionally, but only in whispers, feeders of the divine. They didn't wear robes or crowns. They wore the silence of forests and the stench of old meat. Their eyes were permanently ringed with soot. Not from makeup, but from breathing in the constant smoke of offerings, some floral, some flesh. The villagers thought them holy. The condemned thought them efficient. Neither was wrong. Here's how it began. Every season had its dues. Grain for Vesna, honey for larder. But once or twice a year, when the skies trembled, when the gods blinked, only one thing would do. Something warm, something red, something from the inside, liver specifically. Because to the Slavs, the liver wasn't just meat, it was memory. It held soul residue. To offer a liver was to hand the gods a diary written in blood. And sometimes that diary came from a child. You're watching Hushed Historian, where truth whispers through time. If you enjoy what I dig up for you, subscribe so we don't lose our little historical connection. Thank you. Let's be clear, this wasn't about cruelty, not as we understand it. This was ritual. It had texture. First came the selection, chosen by lot or occasionally divine accident. A crooked foot, a sixth finger, a stutter interpreted as celestial garble. These weren't flaws, they were signatures. The gods had marked their meal, and it fell to the priest to prepare it. Preparation was precise, no blood to touch the ground, that was waste. The altar was lined with bark, changed daily, soaked weekly, burned monthly. The sacrificial subject was given mead laced with henbane, because mercy and madness often wore the same mask, and lulled into stupor, while chants were sung in a tongue so old, even the priests didn't know its meaning. The words didn't matter, the rhythm did. It had to match the heart. Once the rhythm was right, the blade descended, not fast, not slow, methodical. Just under the ribs, past the bone arch. A practiced hand could remove a liver in 30 seconds. 2 if they were lucky. 3 if the gods were distracted and needed coaxing. The organ was raised, steaming, still twitching, toward the eclipse, because that's when the gods were closest. When light fled the world and the veil thinned, you could feel them, sniffing. The liver was then placed onto the altar, coated with herbs, wormwood, thyme, marjoram, and set aflame. Not cremated, braised, smoked, infused, because these weren't just sacrifices, they were banquets. You can smell it in the records. Ancient chroniclers didn't call it cooking, they called it warming the breath of the gods. And yes, there were feasts afterward, but not for the people, not always. Some left hungry, some left haunted, and some, they say, never left at all. But that wasn't even the worst part, because some of those who didn't leave weren't sacrificed, they were initiated. Every so often, a child would stare too long at the altar, not with fear, but hunger. Not for the flesh, but for the closeness, for the gods, and the priests, ever watchful, ever wanting heirs, would take note. These were not chosen by birth or bloodline, they were chosen by stare. And once your eyes locked on the altar long enough, you were never allowed to look away again. Initiation into the Volkhvi wasn't ceremonial, it was anatomical. The child, always young enough to still smell like milk and ash, would be brought to the woods. Not the temple, not the village, the woods, always at night, always under moonlight broken by pine needles. There a priest would cut a line down the centre of their palm and press it to the bark of the oldest tree. If the blood soaked in quickly, the tree had accepted them. If not, the wolves got fed early, Assuming the tree drank, the child was taken deeper. They were not taught, at least not in the usual sense. They were starved for a day, then blindfolded, then fed a stew of mushrooms, bear fat, and fermented berries. After that, things got blurry. One initiate described the taste as cold fire. Another said it made the stars sing in colours. Hallucinations weren't a side effect, they were the curriculum. Because the gods didn't speak in words, they spoke in fever dreams. After 3 days, the blindfold came off, and the child had to walk home, alone, naked. If they made it back, they belonged to the gods. If not, the forest kept what it loaned. Survivors didn't just become priests, they became keepers of secrets, like how to split a liver so that only the memory lobe was offered, or how to catch a scream in a clay pot and bury it beneath the altar to strengthen the next ritual. Yes, that was a thing. Scream jars, buried like bulbs, grown like flowers made of regret. And it wasn't just children. Sometimes entire families would disappear before an eclipse. Not abducted, not punished, just repurposed. Because the gods were hungry, and certain eclipses, particularly the blood moons, required something richer than peasant liver. They wanted lineage, memory stacked on memory, a generational meal. These sacrifices weren't done publicly. They were quiet. The family would be summoned for blessing. No one questioned it. To question the priests was to question the gods. And in those villages, gods didn't bless skeptics. They buried them. The family would be led inside the skull temple. You wouldn't know which skull belonged to which victim. That was the point. Anonymity was holy. Identity was ego. Ego fed no one. Inside the air was thick, like chewing on copper soup. The walls didn't echo. They absorbed. Every sound got swallowed. The floor was always damp, though no one knew why. It hadn't rained in weeks, months sometimes. Each family member was placed in a circle. Salt was poured around them, not as protection, but containment. The priests would walk slowly, murmuring in the old tongue, dragging their bare feet so the sound of skin on stone could join the chant. Then the blade, always obsidian, never dull, never clean. It was believed that to wash the blade was to erase its memory, and the blade needed to remember. Each cut was a punctuation mark in a prayer, but sometimes the gods didn't come, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, the gods would stay silent. No sign, no wind, not even a flicker in the flames. Just thick, choking stillness, the kind that makes even the boldest priest check the shadows twice. When that happened, the priests panicked, but quietly. You see, an unanswered offering wasn't just awkward, it was dangerous. If the gods didn't eat, they might choose to hunt. And when divine predators went hungry, the prey was never predictable. In desperation, the priest turned to the mirror offering. It wasn't part of official doctrine. It was more like a whispered insurance policy. The idea was simple. If the gods won't come to the altar, you bring the altar to the gods. Literally. A mirror polished with dog fat and child's sweat, yes really, was placed above the sacrifice. The liver, steaming, bleeding, reflected upward. As if to say, look, it's you, come closer, eat. And sometimes the mirror cracked, not shattered, cracked. A hairline fracture, diagonal and slow. That was considered a yes, a signal the gods had licked the image. The priests would then sing louder. The smoke would double, and the remains, if any, were ground into powder, mixed with water, and painted in spirals across the temple floor. For what purpose? Even they didn't know. It pleases them, was the answer. That was enough. But sometimes the mirror didn't crack. It melted, a slow sag like glass losing the will to hold itself. And when that happened, the priests did something even stranger. They fed each other. Not fatally, just symbolically. A finger, a chunk of thigh. Enough to show the gods that their servants were willing to give themselves to the cause. And if the gods still refused to respond, the entire temple would go dark for 7 days. All fires extinguished, all chanting ceased, silence imposed like a funeral. Because that's what it was, a funeral for favour, a mourning of divine neglect. During these silences, villagers weren't allowed to speak the names of the gods. Pregnant women were hidden. Newborns weren't named. Animals were not slaughtered. Nothing alive could be turned into meat. It was as if the world was on hold, waiting for an apology that might never come. The priests would lie prostrate on cold stone, wrapped in damp furs, weeping. Not theatrically, not ritually. Real, ugly weeping. Because to be ignored by the gods was the only sin that frightened them. And yet, sometimes, the silence was broken. A bird flying backwards, a deer dropping dead at the village edge, a baby born with teeth. These were signs, not always welcomed, because signs meant hunger was returning, and hunger needed feeding. Quickly. The next sacrifice had to be spectacular. Not just a life, a spectacle, a statement, something unforgettable, something the gods would smell from beyond the stars. That's when they invoked the golden rite. No one liked the golden rite, not the priests, not the villagers, not even the gods if the legends are true. It required a subject of great beauty, someone unspoiled, untouched, but not innocent. There's a difference. Innocence is ignorance, unspoiled means potential. The gods didn't want blank slates. They wanted promises, futures. Taking them made the meal richer. The chosen would be dressed in honey and ash. Honey for sweetness, ash for memory. They were led to the altar barefoot, but not bound. That was the rule. They had to walk willingly. If they resisted, they were spared. The gods, apparently, had standards, but if they walked forward, the priests wept, not from guilt but awe. Because what's more divine than someone offering themselves for the sake of silence? Let's go back a bit. Before the skulls, before the eclipses, before the honey and the ash, back to when the gods were still whispers, and the priests were just madmen talking to trees. The earliest rituals didn't need altars. They needed only dirt, dusk, and desperation. The first offering, it wasn't a liver, it was a heart, freshly cut from a dying animal and buried beneath the roots of a sacred birch. They didn't do this to feed anything. They did it to shut something up. Because the gods of the Slavs weren't benevolent. They weren't kindly grandfathers in the clouds handing out sunshine and harvests. They were chaos incarnate, storms with names, hunger with personalities. The priests didn't pray for blessings. They begged not to be noticed. Sacrifice wasn't a gift, it was a bribe. Stay there, stay sleeping. Here, take this, just don't look over here. And so the rites evolved. The dirt got bloodier, the prayers got longer, the hallucinations more frequent. Eventually, someone noticed that the liver rotted slower than the heart. That was enough to declare it holier. And because it was harder to remove, it required more skill, more pageantry. Suddenly the priest wasn't just a butcher, he was a performer. And the gods, cruel as they were, adored theatre. Temples grew from this need, not built so much as layered. First came the circle of stones, then the woven roof of bark and bone. Later, skulls, always human, always placed with intention. A wall for warriors, a shelf for mothers, a pillar of twins. No names, just arrangements. You didn't need a grave. You were part of the architecture now, immortal by design. But the more they gave, the more the gods demanded. Blood became smoke, smoke became shadow, and one day the priests claimed they had seen them. Not in dreams, not in trance, in flesh, or something like it. They described them as faceless, but not blank, as tall as trees but hunched like beggars, smelling like milk turned inside out. And they came only during eclipses, not because they were summoned, but because that's when they could cross. That's why the eclipses mattered. Not because of the sun, because the veil thinned, and when the veil thinned, the gods could smell the world again. The first time it happened, a storm followed. Not rain, not lightning, just absence. Sound stopped, wind froze, birds flew into fire, and the priest who led the ceremony tore out his own eyes and declared, "They are pleased." No one questioned him. So from then on, every eclipse meant preparation. Livers were fattened in advance, children were observed quietly. Those born under crooked moons were monitored. If they had dreams too vivid, or started sleep speaking in forgotten languages, They were marked, not harmed, not yet. You don't waste a prophecy on impatience. You let it ripen. And that's how the cult grew. Slowly, organically. One child here, one scream there. The rituals weren't enforced, they were felt. Villagers who resisted weren't punished, they were simply left out. Excluded from harvest celebrations. Denied blessings. Ignored when illness came. No violence, just silence. The kind of silence that wraps around your house at night and doesn't leave until you knock on the temple door and whisper, "We're ready." If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what happened to the ones who pretended to be ready. Because not every family that knocked on the temple door meant it. Some did it out of fear, some to gain favour, and a few, just a few, thought they could trick the gods, make the motions, burn the bark, spill the goat's blood, but secretly bury a pig's liver under the altar instead of the real thing. A bait and switch, a spiritual sleight of hand. You'd think the gods wouldn't notice. You'd be wrong. It never happened immediately. That was part of the punishment. First came luck. Yes, luck. Crops grew taller, milk flowed richer, children didn't get sick. It lulled them into comfort, into pride, into forgetting what they'd not given. Then came the dreams. At first harmless, a figure watching from the edge of the forest, a soft voice humming lullabies in reverse. But soon the dreams changed. The figure got closer. The songs turned into whispers, and then into screams. People would wake with soil in their mouths, their hands raw from clawing at the floor. One woman bit off her own fingers in her sleep, said she was feeding him. No one asked who, no one needed to. The final warning was always the same. The mirror fogged. No one touched it. No heat source nearby, just fog. Thick and pulsing like breath. The priests knew then. They'd been tricked. And the gods do not appreciate theatre when they're not the audience. That's when the Red Feast began. The Red Feast wasn't on the calendar. It wasn't sung about in lullabies. It had no place in ceremony. It was vengeance dressed as ritual. The priests would come at dawn, wearing only their soot and bones. They would walk through the village silently. No chants, no drums, just the sound of bare feet on frost. And when they stopped at your door, you didn't run. You opened it, because to run was to curse your bloodline, and the gods loved generational drama. The family was taken whole, again, not screaming. That was the terrifying part. By then, they wanted to go. The dreams had hollowed them out, made them brittle, like wet paper ready to burn. They followed the priests back to the skull temple and stood in silence as the preparations began. The liver wasn't taken from one, it was taken from all. A sliver here, a slice there, enough to patch together a full offering. A mosaic of memory. The gods didn't care about pain, they cared about meaning, and nothing meant more than shared guilt. And when it was over, the family was returned. Scarred, limping, missing pieces, but alive. Because death was release, and the gods didn't give release to liars. They left them breathing. Barely. So the lesson would walk among the village, a living caution sign, a warning carved in skin. But something darker was coming, because eventually the gods stopped waiting for offerings. They started choosing, not through signs, not through dreams, through visits, the kind no one remembered fully, but everyone woke up from soaked in sweat, trembling, and unable to find their voice for hours. The stories started quietly. A child staring into the fireplace too long. A man found standing in a frozen river with no memory of how he got there. A woman who suddenly knew the names of the dead. All of them said the same thing. They spoke, and they're hungry. The priests didn't deny it. They adapted. If the gods were now choosing, then the rites had to follow. The old altar, the one made from skulls, was no longer sufficient. It had been built for devotion. The gods now wanted fear, so a new altar was constructed, deep in the woods, where even the birds didn't go. It wasn't made of stone, it was made of fleshwood. That's what they called it. A rare black-barked tree said to grow only where something unspeakable had died. Its bark was soft, almost like skin, and it bled when cut. The priests carved the altar directly into its roots. No more neatly bound sacrifices, no more polished obsidian blades. Now they used teeth, their own sharpened into jagged points. They tore, they howled, they bled alongside their offerings. The gods liked that. Apparently, pain was more honest than precision. But what truly horrified the villagers wasn't the altar, it was the procession. You see, before each sacrifice, the chosen wasn't led silently in the night anymore. No, now they were paraded at noon, in daylight, in front of everyone. Children were told to watch. So they understand, the priest said. Understand what exactly? No one dared ask. The chosen were smeared with soil, not ash, dressed in torn garments, not ceremonial robes. They walked barefoot over thorns. No one helped. That was the point. If you helped, the gods might think you were volunteering. The priests sang songs that didn't rhyme, melodies that rose and fell like sobbing, the kind of sound that makes your stomach turn without knowing why. And at the altar, the sacrifice was no longer just about the liver. The gods, it seemed, had developed a taste for complexity. They wanted emotion, regret, love. So before the chosen was offered, they were made to speak. Confessions, secrets, names of lovers, sins both petty and profound. The priest said it seasoned the soul, because the gods didn't just eat bodies anymore. They ate stories, and when it was done, the woods stayed silent for days. No wind, no bird song. Just the soft, awful dripping of something no one could ever find. The air felt heavy, like it was watching. The villagers tried to pretend, to keep going, but their eyes never stopped scanning the treetops, because now they knew there wasn't safety in silence anymore. The gods weren't content with being called. They had come to stay. The lines between ritual and reality had blurred. You weren't performing for them, you were living for them. And if they got bored? Well, you didn't want them bored. That's when the first priest vanished. Not died, vanished. One morning his bed was full of salt. Just salt. No blood, no struggle. Just a perfect imprint of his body and a ring of white crystals around it. The others said nothing, but from then on, they began sleeping with knives under their tongues, as if steel could stop what the stars had already invited. And just when the villagers thought they understood the rules, the gods changed them again. The gods demanded music, not the kind played on flutes or drums. No, that was for celebrations. This was for consumption. The new ceremonies began with silence, but not absence of sound. No birds, no voices, no breeze, just the sound of listening. The priests called it the breath before the bite. Then, as the offering was prepared, a different sound began. Not played, breathed, through hollowed reeds taken from the riverbed where drownings had occurred. They were tuned to discord. Each note scraped rather than soothed, and the gods loved it. The chosen were no longer just led. They were choreographed, every step matched to a note. Every gasp of fear, every whimper rehearsed to crescendo. The offering became opera, tragedy without curtain. One priest even said with a straight face, "We are composing agony." He wasn't wrong. And if the gods liked the music, they sent signs. Sometimes a gust of warm wind in winter. Sometimes blood would bead on the altar stone without anyone touching it. But the clearest sign was the echo. A deep, breathless repeat of the ritual chant, coming not from the priests, but from the trees, as if the forest itself had learned the words and decided to join in. After the offering, the remains, if there were any, were no longer buried. They were displayed, hung on branches in geometric patterns, bones bleached and arranged like sacred equations. Some said it was a map, others whispered it was a warning. But the priests insisted it was a gift. They want to see themselves in our endings, one murmured, while tying vertebrae into a spiral. They want to know we've learned. The villagers stopped naming their children until after the first winter. Names attracted attention. Laughter was muffled. Songs were hummed only inside, never aloud. Fear didn't scream anymore. It simmered. like soup too long on the hearth reduced to something thick and unrecognizable. The gods, meanwhile, became personal. People began receiving visits, not in dreams, not in rituals, just visits. A sudden stillness in the room, a shadow where there shouldn't be, a whisper that knew your childhood nickname. One girl claimed she woke to find every object in her home turned upside down. Another swore she vomited soil for a week, though she hadn't touched the ground. The priests called this attention, a blessing technically, but no one wanted it, and when someone did want it, when a villager asked to be chosen, it always ended badly. Not because of punishment, because of disappointment. The gods had no interest in volunteers. They preferred the reluctant, the resistant. Fear flavoured better than fanaticism. Those who begged to be taken were ignored, or worse, marked. And when you were marked, you could feel it. Your breath fogged in warm air. Dogs avoided you. Mirrors refused to show your reflection, or worse, showed you blinking when you hadn't. Eventually, one of the marked snapped. He screamed during the procession, tried to run. He made it 10 steps before collapsing. When the priests reached him, his body was intact, but his tongue was missing. Not cut, just gone, and carved into his chest with perfect symmetry were the words, "No rehearsals." That's when the priests realised the gods weren't watching rituals anymore. They were watching life itself. The whole village had become a stage, and the audience, hungry. But the first plot twist was already on its way, because just when the rituals had reached their most grotesque, and the villagers had settled into fear as a lifestyle, the gods stopped choosing. No visits, no signs, no whispers. The forest went quiet, not peaceful, empty. The reeds cracked but produced no music. The altar grew cold. The priests waited, prayed, bled themselves in desperation. Still nothing. It was as if the gods had gotten up and walked out mid-performance. And for the first time in generations, silence meant something worse than danger. It meant abandonment. The priests, panicked, began to theorize. Had they done too much? Too little? One faction insisted the sacrifices had grown stale, predictable. Another claimed someone among them had broken a rule. A third, more dangerous whisper suggested the unthinkable. Maybe the gods had found a better village. The thought alone sent several into self-mutilation, flaying their skin into runes and hanging themselves on hooks, trying to lure the divine back with spectacle. It didn't work. Then in a twist no one could have predicted, the villagers began dreaming again. But this time, the dreams weren't nightmares. They were warm. Fields of wheat, laughter, children running beneath sunlight that didn't hurt. No teeth, no mirrors, just peace. Some woke weeping, others smiled for the first time in years. One even claimed she felt her dead mother's hand on her face, whispering, "It's over now." The priest called an emergency rite. They dragged the girl to the altar, demanded she renounce the dream. She refused, smiling with a kind of peace that shouldn't exist. So they cut her open, slowly, carefully, and for the first time in their recorded history, the liver came out clean, unblemished, not twitching, not steaming, just still. And when they set it on the altar, nothing happened. No smoke, no whispers, not even rot. It just sat there, inert, a useless organ from a girl who had dared to dream of better. The villagers watched, and something shifted. Tiny, almost invisible, but real, a crack in the fear. Because if the gods weren't watching, then why obey? Why bleed? Why kneel? But the priests weren't ready to lose control. They doubled down, declared a new eclipse was coming, even though the sky disagreed. A spiritual eclipse, they insisted, one of the soul. They began selecting children again, not for sacrifice, for indoctrination, a new generation of priests to restore the old ways. But the children laughed, not cruelly, not defiantly. They just didn't take it seriously. They mimicked the chants, played ritual as a game. One child poured wine on a chicken and called it God juice. Another built a doll altar out of bones and pebbles, crowned it with a flower, and said, "This one's nicer." The priests were horrified, because mockery wasn't just disrespect, it was invitation. If the gods were still watching from somewhere, mockery could wake them, anger them, bring them back in a form no rite could soothe. So the priests ordered the children taken. Not killed, purified. The plan was isolation, starvation, prayer. The usual breaking down of spirit. But when they came for the children, the parents stepped forward. Silently, blocking the doors, not fighting, just standing. And in their eyes was something the priests hadn't seen in years. Choice. And the gods? Still silent. But silence, like a storm, is sometimes just waiting to break. And it broke not with thunder or blood, but with laughter. It started with one boy, the same one who'd made the God juice joke. He climbed atop the old stone well in the centre of the village, slapped a pair of chicken bones to his temples, and began to mimic the priests in a high-pitched falsetto. "O mighty Lord of spleens, we offer thee thy midday snack." The villagers froze. The priests watched, pale with fury. But then someone giggled. A child first, then a mother, then another, and before anyone could stop it, the square rang with uncontrollable laughter. The spell had broken. The priests screamed. They hurled curses, declared the gods would rain fire, that the ground would open, that the trees would scream blood. But nothing happened. The gods, if they were still watching, stayed silent, not indifferent, absent. That night the villagers gathered in secret, not for fear, but for relief. They lit fires not of consecration, but comfort. They sang lullabies with real melody. No backward chants, no bloodletting, just voices, harmony. They burned the scream jars, tore down the skull walls. The fleshwood altar was hacked apart, piece by piece, its bleeding bark tossed into the flames. And when it burned, it didn't cry. It sizzled like meat. The smell was awful, familiar, but necessary. One priest, desperate, tried to stop them. He ran into the flames, shrieking prayers older than language. His body ignited instantly. He didn't scream. He just stared wide-eyed as the flames consumed him. And when it was done, his ashes formed no pattern, no message, just soot on stone, dust like any other. By morning the temple was gone, but freedom came with confusion. If the gods were truly gone, what now? Who would bless the crops? Who would protect the births? What filled the void once left by terror? That was the new dilemma, because for all the horror, the gods had meant something. They were structure. They were rules, twisted, cruel rules, but rules nonetheless. Without them, there was just sky, just wind, just chance. So the villagers began to build again. Not temples, homes, gardens, playgrounds. The skulls that hadn't crumbled were buried in one massive grave, marked not by names, but by flowers. Every flower a memory, every petal a defiance. They raised their children with stories, but not of gods, of people, of resilience, of what it meant to say no to power disguised as holiness. The remaining priests were given a choice: stay and till the soil, or leave and take their silence with them. Some wept and dropped their robes. Others vanished into the woods, muttering curses to a sky that no longer echoed. It was quiet. For years nothing happened. No eclipses, no signs. The mirror, stored in a chest beneath the village square, remained dull. No fog, no fracture, just reflection. Until one evening, a girl now grown looked into it and blinked, but not alone, because sometimes absence isn't departure, it's patience, and hunger, once quiet, doesn't forget. Let's go back again, just once more, to the first whisper, the first time a human dared to imagine a god's appetite. It didn't start with sacrifice, it started with a shadow, not cast by fire, but by absence, a patch of air too still, a place where birds refused to land, where no roots grew, no snow fell, and from that stillness came a need, a presence unshaped, unintelligible, hungry, not evil, just hungry, like the void behind your eyelids when you close them too long. It wasn't malice that birthed the gods, it was misunderstanding. The first priest was no priest at all, just a man who wanted his wife to survive childbirth, who buried a goat's heart in the still patch and begged for mercy. She lived, the goat didn't, and thus a ritual was born. Not out of faith, but desperation, a gamble. The next time, he buried 2 goats, and when the crops thrived, the village took notice. Soon he was no longer just a husband. He was a conduit, a translator, and the gods, sensing reverence, leaned in closer. But the thing about proximity, it invites confusion, because soon the man couldn't sleep. The air in his lungs felt borrowed. The wind outside his hut whispered his name backward. And then one night, his daughter disappeared. Just gone. Her bed unrumpled, her shoes still at the door. Only a smear of blood on the windowsill. And outside, carved into the bark of that cursed patch, was a symbol. No one recognized it, but they all understood what it meant. The gods had taken payment in advance. The man wept, not for her. He knew she was gone. He wept for wanting it to mean something, for needing the trade to feel worth it. He told the village, the gods hunger, they do not love. But by then, it was too late. The people had tasted results. They weren't about to go back to chance, so they made him a high priest, as punishment, as penance, as the first stone in the foundation of a religion, built on not asking too many questions. From there, it was all ritual drift. What began as animal sacrifice became human. What started with hearts shifted to livers, because they held the soul better. Chanting became codified, ash became uniform. And the man? He grew old, quiet. They said he died with a smile. That's not true. He died with his hands over his ears. Because in the final weeks, the gods had started singing to him, and the song was her lullaby, reversed. Centuries later, they would call his writings the first codex, half-burned, mostly gibberish, but one line survived, carved into stone beneath the oldest temple. They do not come when called, they come when ignored. And perhaps that was the greatest sin of the villagers who tried to forget. They stopped fearing, not stopped believing, stopped fearing. And the gods, like neglected fires, don't die. They smoulder, they wait. So when the grown girl blinked into the mirror, what she saw wasn't herself. It wasn't a god either. It was something older, a memory with teeth, and it didn't reach through. It didn't speak. It just watched, patient, proud, because the hunger was returning. But this time, it had learned subtlety. It didn't want temples, it wanted habits. It didn't need priests, it needed stories. It fed on attention. And now, the village had cameras, and the girl had dreams. So what does that mean for a place that once burned scream jars and boiled livers beneath eclipses? It means the gods have found a new altar, one with screens, one with subscriptions, and the curtains only just begun to rise. The girl didn't scream. Not when the reflection blinked on its own. Not when her breath fogged while the room stayed warm. Not even when the mirror began to ripple like water under her fingers. Instead, she stared, long enough for the silence to become something else. A pulse, a rhythm. The beginning of a chant she didn't recognize, but already knew by heart. It wasn't in a language, it was in sensation, like remembering a smell you'd never actually smelled before. That night, she dreamed of roots that crept through her bedroom walls, roots made of ash and meat, curling around her bedposts and whispering in voices that sounded like relatives she'd never met. In the dream, her body was too heavy to move, not paralyzed, anchored, as if the earth itself had claimed her. When she woke, her fingernails were black, not stained, grown that way. She didn't tell anyone, but the signs didn't stop. Animals began avoiding her. Mirrors blurred her face. Her voice echoed when she spoke, even indoors. Her dreams became serialized, a nightly continuation of something unraveling beneath her skin. And always, at the center of it, the altar. Not the old one, a new one, sleek, familiar, lit not by fire, but by screens. One night, she followed the dream, left her house barefoot. The ground was cold, but not biting. more like it was tasting. She walked to the village square, now just a playground surrounded by overgrown gardens. The moon was high, full, but not bright. It looked drained, like a peeled fruit left too long in the sun. And in the centre of the square, where the mirror had been buried decades ago, something pulsed. She dug with her hands. The soil moved like sponge cake, loose, damp, eager. Her fingers found glass, then breath, then warmth. She pulled the mirror free. It was no longer dull, it shimmered, it hissed. And when she looked into it, the thing inside didn't just watch, it smiled. She smiled back, because deep down she wanted it. Not possession, not power, just meaning. A role, something bigger than gardening and avoiding old stories. She pressed her palm to the surface. It didn't ripple, it opened. A hand reached through, her own, but older, weathered, wearing the ash and honey paint of a time forgotten. And from somewhere behind her, a voice she recognised as her own future whispered, "We begin again." The next morning she was gone. The village searched, of course. They found footprints, shallow, delicate, stopping mid-step, no drag marks, no struggle, just absence. The soil where she had stood was warm for days. Birds wouldn't land there. Dogs whined and turned in circles. And then the dreams came back. But this time, not to her, to everyone. Children dreamed of spirals, elders of bleeding trees. Teenagers woke up humming songs they'd never heard. And once again, the chant returned. The breath before the bite. But now, it was digitized. It leaked through headphones, skipped between radio stations, appeared in the background of live streams no one remembered recording. A frequency, low and guttural, that felt more like chewing than sound. The mirror didn't go back in the ground. It went on display, quietly. No big announcement. Just placed behind glass in the old schoolhouse, now a makeshift museum of village heritage. Tourists came, took photos. Some complained their pictures came out blurry. Others swore they saw someone else's face in the reflection. No one questioned it. It was rustic. It was charming. It was folklore. But the girl was never found, and her name began to vanish, from records, from memory, from stone, because something was rewriting the script, and it wasn't done casting, because the gods, or whatever they become, didn't want worship anymore. They wanted performance. Every person in the village was now a character, every gesture a line of dialogue, each day rewritten like a scene. You didn't need to kneel, you just had to play your part. And if you didn't know your part yet, don't worry. They'd write it for you. The shift was subtle at first. A boy laughed too long at nothing. A woman started answering questions before they were asked. At the bakery, people found their bread marked with unfamiliar runes, burned into the crust like old sigils, reawakened in yeast and smoke. One man coughed up a tooth. Not his, not human. It was square and carved with scenes too small to see. He kept it, carried it in his pocket, whispered to it at night. The mirror remained quiet, but it gleamed brighter. Light didn't reflect off it, it lingered. Hung in the air like mist. People avoided eye contact with it, but not out of fear anymore. Out of respect, like a director watching from behind the curtain. Always watching, always rewriting. Then came the children's drawings. At first innocent, trees, houses, pets. But then, the black tree, the screaming sun, a figure with no face and too many hands, a stage built from bones, and always, always a spiral. Not drawn, but felt, pressed into the paper like a bruise. The teachers asked questions. The children shrugged. We just know it. No defiance, no mockery, just certainty. Like they'd been born into rehearsal. And that's when the old stories returned. Whispers of the scream jars, of the blood songs, of the procession of honey and ash. Not as warnings, not even as memories, as legends, told around fires with wide eyes and reverent tones. Teenagers dared each other to sleep near the mirror. Some claimed they saw the girl. Others said she spoke. One boy swore he heard her say, "It's almost ready." Ready for what? He didn't know, or wouldn't say. And then the theatre reopened. Not literally. It had burned decades ago, but one night lights flickered on in the ruins. No electricity, no explanation, just glow, golden, flickering, pulsing in time with the dreams. And inside, chairs, repaired, a stage rebuilt from driftwood and wire, and at the centre, a script, one page, blank. Except for the title, The Return. They called it art. The town rallied. Tourists flooded in. Documentaries were made. Hashtags trended. The mirror became a local marvel. People touched it, filmed it, tried to debunk it, but no one could explain the missing frames, the blurry voices, the way people stared just a little too long into their reflections before laughing nervously and walking away. Changed. One filmmaker vanished. Left behind was his camera. The footage was wrong. It played backwards. The timestamps flickered. And in one frame, just one, you could see the altar, the original one. The skulls rebuilt, the obsidian knife still wet. And standing above it, the girl. Still smiling, still waiting, wearing robes that shimmered like static. And in the background, the villagers, all of them, chanting without sound, smiling without joy, watching without blinking. The footage was buried, but not forgotten. Because some stories don't end. They just change genre, from horror to history, from memory to prophecy, and every generation adds a new scene, a new twist, a new sacrifice wrapped in metaphor. And now, the spiral turns again. Right on cue, because the next plot twist was already carved into someone's skin. They just hadn't noticed yet. Until one girl did. She was brushing her teeth when she spotted it, a pattern beneath the skin of her shoulder. Not a rash, not a bruise, something deeper, like ink submerged in flesh. At first she thought it was a shadow, then a birthmark, then a trick of the bathroom light. But when she touched it, it tingled, cold, familiar, and it moved, slowly, almost imperceptibly, like it was reacting to being seen. She didn't scream, she stared. It looked like a spiral, but with too many arms, an octopus sketched by a blind man on a broken compass. The moment she acknowledged it, her reflection blinked. Not her, the reflection. It blinked late, out of sync, and behind her own image there was something else, a figure, faceless, draped in symbols, holding a theatre mask made of polished bone. She turned around, nothing there, but when she turned back, her reflection was smiling. Not with her lips, with her eyes. That was worse. She staggered back, panting, and the mark on her shoulder pulsed. Her phone buzzed, a notification, an email she didn't remember subscribing to. Subject line, "The next act begins." No sender, no message body, just a timestamp. 3 nights from now, she didn't sleep, she couldn't. When she closed her eyes, she saw curtains, velvet, wet. They opened to a stage made of glass and hair. An audience of shadows sat silently, all breathing in unison, and in the centre, herself. Bound by chains made of mirrors, forced to smile, forced to perform. The village felt it too. The animals grew restless. Milk soured in seconds. The mirror began humming. A low, subaudible vibration you couldn't hear, but felt in your teeth. People dreamed in static. Children began sleepwalking, forming circles in the square at midnight. Their hands bled from being held too tightly. The girl tried to leave. She packed a bag, stole her mother's keys, and drove. Fast, far, but the roads looped, GPS froze, the sky changed colour. At one point she saw herself standing on the shoulder of the highway, just watching, just waiting. By dawn she was back at her doorstep. Inside, her parents were already awake, smiling too much, speaking in tones that felt rehearsed. "You had to try," her mother said softly. "That's what makes the ending work." The girl ran. She didn't know where, just away, through the woods, toward the old theatre ruins, the place where it had all started, or ended, or paused. And when she reached it, the lights were on. She stepped inside, no sound, just the soft flicker of flame. On stage, the mirror waited, cleaned, polished, waiting like a mouth. Beside it, a book. Her name on the cover. Inside, blank pages except one. The script. It wasn't long. Just a few lines. You return, you speak, you are received, and then you're rewritten, she screamed. The audience applauded, because the gods weren't coming back. They had come back, not as beasts, as writers. And now, the edits had begun. The girl didn't vanish. Not exactly. She just changed drafts. Her body was found the next day by the bakery, sitting upright on a bench she hadn't sat on in years. Eyes open, breathing steady, but silent. Not mute, erased. Her skin was flawless. Too flawless, like something that had been re-rendered. There were no fingerprints on her hands anymore. Her nails were polished black. Not painted, just that colour now, permanent. They brought her home. She nodded when spoken to, ate when fed, but no one could recall her original name. Even her family just called her the girl. Everyone did. Even she did, when she finally spoke. I'm her, she said simply, but not yet. That line became legend. By the end of the week, others started changing too. Slowly. Not with violence, but edits. One man forgot his own job, then found himself carving runes into wood, with no memory of learning how. A woman woke up with her wedding ring fused to her finger, though her husband had died a decade ago. Teenagers began writing in journals, with ink that only appeared under candlelight, and every entry ended with the same phrase, end of scene. The village was no longer a village, it was a set. The buildings rearranged themselves, ever so slightly. Doors moved, windows swapped sides, a forest path turned to stone, a well filled with ash instead of water. People accepted it. They felt it, like actors receiving stage directions mid-performance. No questions, just cues. And above it all, the mirror pulsed. It had been moved to the centre of the new square. No one remembered who moved it. It was just there, mounted in a frame of black wood and bone, not protected, displayed. Lit by torches that never ran out of oil. Tourists still came, but they didn't leave. They became extras, walk-ons in a narrative no one was writing, but everyone was following. The girl began hosting gatherings. Every full moon, she stood beneath the mirror and read from her book. The pages were still mostly blank, but each time a new line appeared, always in her handwriting, always prophetic. The villagers gathered in rows, not kneeling, sitting, watching, applauding when she finished, even if nothing had been said, even if the only words were, we watch, we wait, we rewrite. By now the gods weren't just present. They were producers, tweaking, cutting, recasting. One man aged backwards. His wife sobbed joyfully until he became a child, then an infant, then dust. His clothes folded themselves. Another woman began floating 2 inches off the ground. Not flying, just unseated. Gravity decided she wasn't part of this scene, and she accepted it. Just smiled, said she always hated shoes anyway. Reality itself was on a rewrite schedule, and the priests, what was left of them, were laughed at. Their robes had turned grey, their chants echoed in reverse. They tried one last ritual, built from salt and scars, but when they lit the fire, it spelled out one word in smoke. Cut. They vanished after that. The next morning their homes were empty, furniture gone, beds made, a note on each door. Scene wrapped. The girl, now called director by some, never claimed authority. She just existed, smiling, waiting, reading. Her eyes sometimes turned black, sometimes mirrored, sometimes a deep crimson that bled into her cheeks, but always she was there, and the spiral on her shoulder. It grew, and now when the villagers slept, they dreamed in script format. Int. Village night. A figure approaches, the chant begins, because the next act was already being staged, and the curtain never truly falls in a place like this. The villagers stopped keeping track of days, not out of apathy, but because the sun had become unreliable. It rose, yes, but not always where it should. Sometimes it hovered in the east for hours. then leapt across the sky like someone had skipped forward in a timeline. The moon drifted too. Once it appeared in the mirror's reflection at noon, large and red, weeping streaks of black across its craters. Children clapped when it did. Adults looked away. The girl, director, oracle, her, became the axis of everything. She stopped speaking, unless reciting. Her mouth only opened for written words. When she laughed, it echoed with delay, like an old cassette catching up. She carried the book always, the one that wrote itself. Sometimes she would stop mid-step, open to a blank page, and her hands would shake. Words would rise like steam, ink forming from nothing. One page read simply, "He returns tonight." No name, no warning, just inevitability. That evening the village prepared, not with fear, with purpose. They lit the black lanterns made of obsidian and salted wax. They arranged the seating. They dressed in ash-grey robes, not stitched but folded into being from sheets no one had remembered owning. The mirror pulsed like a heart, slow, certain. The stage was empty, no props, no set, just space. And then, at midnight, a scream rang out. Not from pain, from arrival. He didn't walk into the village, he was revealed. Like a layer peeled from reality. One moment empty air, the next, a figure cloaked in stitched shadows. Face obscured by a mask carved from bone and brass. Tall. Wrong. Bent forward like a question mark. And in his right hand, a script of skin. Still wet, still warm. He didn't speak, but the villagers understood him. Because the script began to read itself, each word projected into the minds of those present, not as sound, but as memory. Suddenly each person remembered things that hadn't happened yet. A future sacrifice, a betrayal, a kiss that turned the stars inside out. Their own deaths, their own resurrections, not metaphorical, planned. One man tried to run. He made it halfway down the old orchard path before stopping. Not frozen, paused, mid-stride, arms flailing, a single frame in a broken animation. His mouth opened. A moth flew out. The girl wrote that down. She looked up. "He's not here to punish," she said. "He's here to edit." The villagers bowed. Not because they were commanded, but because they felt it. That pressure in the spine when something older than time glances your way. And the editor, if that's what he was, began moving. Not walking, shifting. From place to place like he was cutting and pasting his own presence. Everywhere he stood, the world changed. A fountain flowed backward. A child grew 3 inches in seconds. A blind woman blinked and wept, seeing for the first time, only to immediately scream and claw at her eyes. Because what she saw wasn't beauty, it was true form. Reality raw, no filters, no fiction. Just meat and meaning. And the spiral on the girl's shoulder? It rotated, literally, skin turning like gears. Her eyes rolled white, her lips parted. She began to chant in reverse, names, dates, directions. The editor placed a finger to her head and cut. She collapsed, breathing, smiling, and the script rewrote itself, because the next role had just been cast, and the understudies were watching. They always had been. Not hidden, not waiting in shadows, just unnoticed, background characters in their own lives, the ones who never spoke in town meetings, the ones whose homes stayed unlit at night, the ones who never quite fit. Their names weren't remembered, their faces blurred in photos. They didn't mourn when the gods returned because they never stopped believing. They had kept the old ways, but not through ritual, through restraint, silence, observation. And now, their moment had come. The director, still sprawled at the foot of the stage, wasn't unconscious. She was buffering. Her eyes flickered with symbols, ancient, digital, arterial. Her limbs twitched in tempo, with a chant no one could hear yet. Around her, the crowd remained still. Not frozen, suspended, like puppets mid-pull, breathless, eyeless, open-mouthed and unblinking. The editor raised his script. Pages turned themselves. Some bled, others shimmered. One caught fire without smoke. He plucked a glowing word from the air, stretched it into a line of light, and carved it into the dirt. The spiral reacted, no longer just on the girl's shoulder, but etched into every surface. Walls, eyes, tongues. It pulsed like a heartbeat, a countdown. Then one of the understudies moved. She stepped forward from the line of statuesque villagers. Young, perhaps 16, hair like coal dust, eyes like turned soil. She wore no robe, no ornament, just a tunic smeared with soot and honey. The editor looked at her, not with curiosity, but expectation. Like a director awaiting a monologue he already knew. She didn't speak, she sang. A single note, low, wounded, made of dirt and blood and fog. It cracked the air. The village square trembled. The mirror pulsed so hard, it shattered and didn't break. The pieces hovered, each one reflecting a different timeline. In one, the girl was fire. In another, she was ash. In a third, she was both. The villagers began to cry, not out of fear, out of memory. The song awakened truths, things they'd buried beneath rolls, beneath scripts. The boy who'd stolen food during the famine. The mother who'd let her second-born freeze so her first could live. The priest who once loved a man and flogged himself for decades because of it. The song laid them bare, and the editor, he smiled. He handed the girl his pen, a quill made of hair and something that looked like bone but tasted like static. She took it. No hesitation, and wrote one word into the book. Recast. The director gasped, sat up, looked around as if seeing for the first time. Where am I? She whispered. The crowd answered in one voice, Act 2. And just like that, the world blinked. Sky turned inside out. Ground shivered and settled into new patterns. The bakery became a library. The well became a pit of stars. Names rewrote themselves. The villagers rearranged like chess pieces on a board with too many dimensions. Not chaos, design. Because the old gods were no longer gods. They were narratives. Hungry for retellings. Craving reinterpretation. No longer content with livers and chants. They wanted meaning, evolution. And the village, it was a living draft. The understudies bowed, their song complete, and above them something began to type. Not keys, not fingers, but intention. Because the rewrite wasn't finished yet. Not even close. The village didn't wake up the next day. Because there were no more days. Time as a linear idea had been removed, snipped from the script like a scene that dragged. The sun now rose only when the plot demanded light. The moon appeared mid-afternoon if the mood required melancholy. Clocks melted. Calendars spun like possessed compasses. And the villagers? They adapted. They no longer remembered what before felt like. They spoke in present tense, even about the dead. The boy is swallowed by the well, someone might say. Not was, is, because somewhere, in some version of the story, he always will be. The girl, no longer the director, wandered the village like a retired prophet. Her eyes returned to their natural shade, but the spiral never left her skin. It had migrated now, onto her neck, winding upward like ivy. She spent her hours whispering into jars. Not scream jars, echo jars, each one sealed with wax and buried beneath doorsteps. She never said what was inside them. One man dug his up. His ears bled for 3 days. Afterward, he only spoke in proverbs that hadn't been written yet. The editor remained, not present, but implied. His figure seen in shadows, his voice heard in typos. When someone stuttered, they felt his gaze. When a tree fell with no wind, they whispered his name. Not in reverence, in acknowledgement, like one nods to the inevitable. And then, changes began again. Not large, not cinematic, deliberate. A baby was born speaking, fluent. Her first words were, "This one's for the callbacks." She refused to blink. Her parents didn't question it. Another man began leaking sand from his mouth, constantly. Coarse, black, no sauce. He carried a bucket and apologised often. The spiral reappeared in crops, in teeth, in snowfall, in dreams, especially the dreams. Every villager now shared the same nightly episode. A theatre, empty. One seat occupied. Always the same person in the seat, the watcher. Faceless, clapping with no hands. When asked who it was, responses varied. The future, some said. The original writer, said others. But one child, shivering, eyes wide, whispered the truest answer. It's us. Because deep down, everyone knew they weren't just in the story. They were the storytelling. The sacrifice had evolved. No more blood. Now it was perspective, identity, certainty. Every day was an offering, every thought a tithe. And just when the villagers thought they'd adjusted, the book changed hands. The girl placed it in the library, beneath the old bakery's stone. Anyone could open it. Anyone could add. Most were afraid. But one day, a teenager, bored, irreverent, brave, scribbled in the margins, "Add a dragon." The next morning a thunderous roar echoed from the mountains. Not wings, not scales, just presence. Something massive, molten, amused. It didn't descend, it just made itself known. The villagers gathered. The girl read the new line aloud, smiled. "So it begins." "What begins?" someone asked. She didn't answer, because the dragon wasn't a creature. It was a genre shift. The rewrite had moved from folk horror to mythopoeia, from whispered dread to epic inevitability. They weren't just characters anymore. They were legends in progress. And somewhere, in a theatre that no longer needed walls, the faceless watcher clapped once. The echo lasted hours, and it didn't fade. It embedded. People felt it vibrating through their spines for days. Church bells chimed in its rhythm without anyone ringing them. Trees leaned slightly in one direction, as if bowing to something just off stage. Babies giggled in sync with the beat. It was less of a sound now, and more of a punctuation mark, a metaphysical comma between what had been and what was coming. The dragon never landed. It hovered in implication, its silhouette stitched into the horizon whenever the clouds turned red. No eyes, no wings, just suggestion. It breathed myths into existence. Statues wept honey. Wells whispered rhymes. A farmer claimed his potatoes were speaking in ancient tongues. When asked what they said, he replied, "They miss the blood." No one laughed. Because they all remembered, even if they weren't supposed to. The director, now just the girl again sort of, became quieter. Not out of fear, out of reverence. She had begun to write her dreams in reverse. The book accepted them. Pages turned themselves when she entered a room. Her handwriting, once chaotic, now spiraled like vines around the margins. She wasn't leading anymore. She was translating. And the villagers, they leaned into the story. A blacksmith forged keys that didn't unlock anything, but when held, made you forget your worst memory for exactly 1 hour. A midwife birthed twins who spoke only in riddles and whose skin shimmered slightly under candlelight. Someone rebuilt the old altar, not out of faith, out of aesthetic necessity. It was used once, but no one saw who stepped onto it. Only that, afterward, the wind smelled like cloves and morning. The book started asking questions, literal ones, written in red. Who are you when no one's watching? What would you sacrifice to never be forgotten? What do you think they really want? People began answering. In poems, in recipes, in confessions slipped between pages during storms. Some wrote in blood, some in dust, some in dream ink, only visible when you weren't looking directly at it. And the spiral, it stopped appearing. Because it didn't need to. It was inside them now, not as a mark, as a worldview, a quiet little coil in the brain that pulsed whenever the plot twisted. They started predicting each other's lines, not because they rehearsed, because they'd become self-aware, fully, beautifully, tragically. They knew they were part of something crafted, and they didn't care. It wasn't submission, it was participation. Finally. Like dancers realizing the choreography was inside their bones all along. But not everyone embraced it. A few remembered the old faith, the gods before narrative, the gods who fed on fear, not foreshadowing. They called themselves the unwritten. Dressed in charcoal and silence, refused to speak except in shrieks, claimed the dragon was a lie, that the book was a trap, that they could feel the real gods, buried under plot and polish, waiting to rise again. They started building something, underground. No one knew what, but sometimes, if you listened hard enough, you could hear chanting beneath your floorboards. Words that didn't belong in any genre, sounds that unravelled comprehension. And just like that, the village became a battlefield. Not of violence, of versions. It started subtly. The same conversation replaying, word for word, with a different tone. A house existing in two locations simultaneously. People remembering different weather for the same day. Arguments broke out over which reality was correct, as if the village hadn't already sacrificed that idea like a goat on an obsidian altar. The book offered no clarification. Instead, it added a line, "Let the drafts compete." Reality became contested space. Versions layered like old wallpaper. In one version, the baker was blind. In another, she was a prophet. In yet another, she'd never existed, but was mourned like a saint. The villagers didn't pick sides. They switched roles. One morning, a child would wake up with memories of being 40. A man would remember a war that never happened. A woman claimed to have written the book in a previous life, but only in her left dreams. And the unwritten, they grew bolder. Their underground hymn was now a constant hum beneath every scene. They walked among the villagers with pale eyes and stitched mouths. They handed out blank pages, then stared at you until you wrote something. Anything. Even a lie. Especially a lie. Because they believed the original gods could be unearthed through contradiction. That a story collapses if told from enough angles. The dragon remained still. Its shape pulsed in the sky, but its shadow grew restless. At night, it slithered through alleys, whispering alternate endings into open windows. People began to wake with new scars, ones they hadn't earned yet. Scars that throbbed in the presence of fire or laughter. Scars that spelled out names they'd never heard until the moment they dreamed them. The girl, translator, archivist, maybe relic, began to unravel. Not visibly, narratively. She'd forget entire days, speak in scenes that hadn't happened yet. Her voice layered, 3 versions at once, sometimes overlapping, sometimes contradicting. She stopped carrying the book. Instead, she carried scissors. She would enter homes and silently cut objects in half. Books, mirrors, candles, shoes, no explanation. Just a small nod when she was done, as if removing something redundant from a manuscript only she could see. One evening she whispered to the wind, "We're in Act 3 now. That's when betrayals peak." And the next morning the orchard bled. Apples hung rotting and fresh on the same branch. Bees sang lullabies that made listeners forget their own names. The paths through the trees looped endlessly, unless you walked them backward, humming the book's first line in reverse. And the faceless watcher, still clapping. Only now, each clap fractured the air a little more. The sky began showing previews, glimpses of other possible outcomes. A plague of glass insects. A child crowned in smoke. A funeral for language itself. The villagers watched entranced. Some cheered, some wept, some whispered to their reflections, trying to make side deals with whoever was scripting this madness. But the unwritten had a plan. They'd found the first draft. Buried beneath the old well, scrawled on cured skin. Written in a language made of touch and hunger. It had no punctuation, no structure, just desire. Raw, ancient, blood-wet intention. They believed if they could recite it in full, they could overwrite everything. Purge the village of narrative, return it to chaos, to hunger, to bone and breath and dirt. The villagers gathered, sides were chosen, but not through war cries, through tone, through syntax, through subtext, because when everything is a story, even rebellion needs good pacing. The first true act of violence wasn't loud, it was a sentence, written in chalk on the old chapel's steps. 5 words, jagged and uneven, like they were etched with trembling hands. The spiral is a lie. That morning, birds fell from the sky, dead before they hit the ground. Bread wouldn't rise. Fires crackled with voices instead of heat. Everyone knew what the chalk meant. Someone had edited the truth. The girl, scissors still in hand, stood in silence before the words. She didn't erase them. She traced each letter with a fingertip and nodded once, as if confirming a plot twist she hadn't written, but recognised. That night, she lit a candle that burned blue and watched as the book's ink bled across pages. Not red this time. Silver. Reflective. When she touched it, her fingers came away speaking. Yes, speaking. Her fingertips whispered memories. Some hers, some borrowed, some from futures that hadn't decided if they existed. She slept with gloves on after that. The villagers were splintering. Not physically, ideologically. The spiralist clung to the book like scripture, believing every chaos was necessary, that the edits were divine, that the dragon was simply the next phase of language. The unwritten offered no promises, only the release of coherence, a life without foreshadowing, without theme, pure reaction, pure flesh. They began smearing their faces with soot and wrapping themselves in blackout curtains, trying to become plotless. The girl tried to negotiate. She carried a mirror to the unwritten's leader, an old woman who spoke only through riddles drawn on onion skin. The girl offered the mirror as a gesture. The woman laughed, wrote, "Too late, the reflection has already chosen," then swallowed the message. Some said the dragon blinked that night. The book began questioning itself. Words appeared, then vanished. Sentences contradicted earlier entries. One day, it announced the girl was dead, while she stood 3 feet away, reading it aloud. Another day, it rewrote a wedding as a funeral, and vice versa. No one knew if the couples involved had changed, or if they'd always been like that. And still, the village functioned, barely. Markets were held in silence. Currency was bartered emotion. Grief, joy, lust, terror, bottled, labelled, traded. A kiss from someone who'd forgotten your name was now worth 2 pounds of flour. A sob from a stranger could buy you a knife. Some villagers hoarded laughter. Others collected nightmares like wine. And then came the tremors, not earthquakes, edits. Reality skipped. Seconds repeated. People stuttered and glitched. A man aged 30 years in an instant, then crumbled into salt. A baby spoke in a voice so deep it cracked windows. Time was being rewritten on the fly. The book now had footnotes, written in a hand none recognised, signed only the archivist. Who was the archivist? Some said it was the mirror itself. Others believed the dragon had chosen an emissary, a new narrator. The girl said nothing. She simply stood at the edge of the orchard, staring at a tree that bled ink from its bark and whispered, "We're close," someone asked. "To what?" She didn't blink when she answered. "To the rewrite of death." And that was the moment everyone realised this wasn't the climax. It was the preface to something worse. Because what could possibly follow the rewrite of death? The girl started drawing spirals again, not on her skin, but on others. With her scissors, she gently traced the curve into someone's shoulder, or the back of their hand, or the hollow at the base of a throat. No blood, no pain, just a slight shimmer in the flesh afterward. Those marks began speaking in tenses that hadn't been invented. Phrases like, "I will have once been," or "This could have never happened again." Grammar fractured like stained glass struck by a hymn. The book adjusted, its spine bulged, pages multiplied overnight. Chapters rearranged themselves. A table of contents appeared, but in symbols, not language. No one could read it. Everyone felt it. A roadmap of inevitability. Like the outline of a labyrinth you'd already walked but couldn't remember escaping. Then the funeral stopped, because no one died. Not really. Bodies collapsed, yes. Breath ceased. Eyes dulled. But the dead didn't go. They lingered. Some just sat at their own graves, watching the clouds swirl like stirred ink. Others stood in corners, whispering lines from stories no one had written yet. A few returned to their homes and resumed old habits, stoking fires, humming lullabies, cooking meals they no longer needed. The village didn't question it. They adapted. Death was now a transition, not an ending. A change in narrative format. You didn't mourn the dead, you rewrote them. Gave them new arcs. One boy's father became the town's archivist, endlessly copying his son's journal into bark, so trees would remember him. A widow spoke nightly with her wife's echo, now living in the well, speaking through the ripples, but the unwritten weren't pleased. Their gospel demanded oblivion, not persistence, finality, not reinvention. They began performing counter-rituals, rituals of deletion. One involved burning words aloud at sunrise. Another required burying your name under 3 stones, then forgetting which one held it. Their most feared right? Silence, absolute, no eye contact, no movement, a full hour of negation. It drained them visibly, but afterward, reality glitched, briefly. The sky flickered, the book screamed in its sleep. Yes, the book screamed, only once, but loud enough to crack the orchard trees. The girl wept when she heard it, because she knew what it meant. The book wasn't just being read anymore. It was being haunted by earlier drafts, by scrapped endings, by characters that had once existed, but had been deemed too dangerous, too loud, too true. They were bleeding back in through the margins, manifesting, not as people, as possibilities, flickers at the edge of vision, words you almost said, paths you almost took. And then came the red rains, thick, viscous, smelling faintly of ink and sweat. It stained everything. It wrote messages on windows. You remember us? Don't turn the page. The footnotes are lying. The villagers began wearing veils. Not for modesty, for misdirection. They thought if they blurred their features, maybe they'd be overlooked in the next rewrite. The girl stayed inside. She boiled black feathers and dripped the oil into her eyes. Not for blindness, but context. She wanted to see what the book refused to show. One night, she emerged from her cottage and announced, "We've reached the interlude." No one asked what that meant. They could feel it. The dragon's silhouette shifted. Its wings finally moved, and below the mirror, long silent, began to whisper. Just one phrase, over and over, resume from deletion. The whisper didn't stop. Not day or night. It hissed from the mirror in pulses like breath through cracked glass. Louder if you listened too hard, softer when you turned away, but always there. A broken mantra from the throat of some unseen editor who had never forgiven a forgotten line. And then the first erasure happened. Not death, not glitch, absence. Mira, the old weaver who embroidered prophecy into tablecloths, simply stopped existing. Her home remained, her cat meowed by the fire, but her presence vanished. No corpse, no farewell. Her name became a splinter. Everyone remembered her being, but no one could speak it aloud without biting their tongue. Her loom unravelled by itself, thread pulling back into the skein like time rewinding. That's when the villagers started writing everything down, every conversation, every object, every emotion, desperate to anchor themselves to the page. They stuffed books under their pillows, strapped journals to their thighs, whispered daily summaries into jars. The book offered no help. It had begun to redact its own chapters. Thick black strokes erased entire episodes, entire people, replaced by chilling footnotes like, "Scene deemed inconsistent, removed for clarity." The girl grew quieter still. She stopped tracing spirals. Instead, she listened, always to the mirror, to the wet scratching under the pages. She began to mimic the whisper, resume from deletion. At first it terrified everyone, but then she explained, it's not a threat, it's an invitation. An invitation to what? She didn't know, not yet, but the mirror was remembering the versions that shouldn't exist, drafts abandoned, sacrifices scrubbed clean, mistakes that still wanted closure. The rain thickened, villagers started coughing ink, babies were born with no faces, not blank, just smooth, undecided, waiting for a character. The unwritten took credit. They said it was working. That negation was cleansing the village, that they'd almost reached the raw story beneath all this noise. But their eyes had changed, empty, reflective, as if looking at them was looking at your own absence. One of them, Jurek, slit his throat before a crowd. Blood poured in silence, but he didn't fall. He just vanished. In his place, a floating paragraph of red letters that rearranged themselves into a riddle. The book screamed again, louder. Pages flew from it like birds. Some caught fire mid-air, others dissolved into ash that sang lullabies as it settled. A single phrase burned into the cover. She was never the first. The girl didn't sleep after that. She confessed to a child, one of the dream twins, that she'd started seeing others, other girls, in mirrors, in puddles, in shadows behind her own blinking. Girls just like her, holding books, holding scissors, all looking terrified. "I think," she said, "we're all echoes, none of us original, just recursive grief." And that night, the spiral turned, literally. The tattoo on her neck spun like a compass, and every marked villager collapsed. Not dead, edited. They awoke knowing different languages, different lovers. One man no longer recognized his own child. A woman claimed she'd once had 3 arms. The fabric of continuity crumpled. But that wasn't the twist. The twist was that no one wanted to go back. They liked the new versions. Some even begged to be rewritten again. One child, shaking with awe, whispered, "I think I used to be cruel. Thank you." And just as acceptance began to take root, the book added a new chapter. Chapter 0. A beginning that had never been told. A source event. A cause so dangerous it had been deleted by the original gods before the first draft. The girl touched the page and bled. And that's when the editor returned. Not through the front door, not with thunder or lightning, not even with a scream. The editor returned by being noticed. First in footnotes that reworded themselves mid-sentence. Then in the shadows that refused to follow physics. Finally, in the pause between breaths, when you swore you heard a red pen uncapping. When the villagers turned to look, he was already there, standing beside the mirror, wearing pages as robes. Not stitched, grown. Each sheet pulsed like skin. Ink veins moved beneath the surface, forming questions that changed before you could read them twice. The girl said nothing. She didn't have to. He nodded once and she handed him the book. Not with fear, with recognition. Like 2 musicians who've been playing the same silent duet across time. He didn't open it. He held it, and the village held its breath. The editor walked to the chapel. It was already burning. Not with fire, with language. The walls dripped consonants. The altar hissed vowels. He stepped inside and began reading. Aloud. But not the current draft, not chapter 0. He read the deletions, the scenes no one remembered, the choices erased for convenience, the truths too heavy to narrate. Each word he spoke removed something from the world. He said, "mercy," and 2 people forgot why they'd ever forgiven anyone. He said, "mother," and someone's hands turned to smoke. He said, "safe," and the mirror shattered. Not into glass, but memories, thousands of them fluttering down like ash, each one demanding to be relived. Screams echoed, laughter curdled. Someone cried out, "We already suffered through this." The editor answered, "Not completely." And then he turned to the girl. "You began the spiral," he said. "Finish it." She stepped forward, eyes black with borrowed ink, scissors in one hand, a blank page in the other. He held out his hand. Together, they folded the page into a blade. Not metaphorically, not poetically. A literal paper knife, sharp enough to cut reality. They turned together and slashed downward into the air. It ripped, not with sound, with absence. A hole formed, perfectly rectangular. A deleted scene, waiting to be reinserted. The village recoiled. The unwritten fell to their knees, gibbering in delight. One shouted, "The original breath returns." Another wept, "We are footnotes no more." Inside the hole, nothing, and everything. All the versions that had been tried and tossed. A village that had burned instead of rewritten. A girl who had died on the first page. A dragon who devoured gods and wept because no one wrote it a name. And in the centre, still and humming, was chapter 0. written in a hand no one remembered, but everyone recognized. The cause, the choice, the origin glitch. The editor stared at it, then closed the hole, folded the rip like origami, slipped it into the book and shut it without a sound. He turned to the girl and said, "If you open it again, it's yours," and vanished. Not in smoke, in punctuation. A semicolon shimmered in the air where he stood, indicating the sentence wasn't over. The villagers didn't cheer. They just stood there, watching the girl. The book trembled in her arms. One child whispered, "What now?" And the girl, without smiling, without crying, replied, "We skip the climax." Because even endings can be edited. They didn't question her. Not because they trusted her, but because by now, questioning had become a liability. Every inquiry was a thread, and every thread risked pulling apart the entire tapestry. The girl had declared the climax skipped, and so the story obeyed. No crescendo, no showdown. Just silence, strange and humming, thick enough to choke on. But skipping the climax didn't stop the consequences. It merely misfiled them. The book grew heavier, not with mass, with gravity. Shelves bent under it. Floors buckled. When she walked, it dragged behind her, carving shallow furrows in the dirt that glowed faintly under moonlight. The villagers learned to step over them, except one boy, who tripped and disappeared. No scream, just a footnote left in the mud. Scene redacted due to irrelevance. The dragon reappeared. Not in the sky, in reflections. Any surface with enough gloss began showing a coiled mass just out of frame. Coils like intestines, like writing, like doubt. If you looked too long, your name reversed itself on your tongue and refused to change back. One woman forgot how to say I. From then on, she spoke only in third-person past tense. Still, the village functioned, barely. Children played games with no rules. Elders spoke in syntax loops, beginning each sentence with their own endings. One man spent 6 days trying to remember the word for door, and in the process invented 3 new religions. People clung to structure in whatever form they could find. They made rituals out of nonsense. One group bowed to a rusted bucket every morning, claiming it held echoes of an alternate plotline. Another burned hair on Thursdays to ward off deleted metaphors. But beneath it all, the spiral pulsed. No longer ink, no longer mark, now a sound. A low, bone-deep resonance, heard only at the edge of decisions. When someone hesitated, it would hum. When someone lied, it would vibrate. When someone tried to leave the village, it would scream. Softly, regretfully. As if disappointed that anyone still believed escape was a real motif. The girl, meanwhile, rewrote nothing. She carried the book, but did not open it. Instead, she began building something at the centre of the village. A spiral tower, each level a different material. Bone, bark, glass, memory. No blueprint, no help. She carved stories into the walls, unwritten ones. Tales no one remembered living, but recognised with a shudder. She never explained. Just worked, day and night. Like a printer possessed. And then one evening, someone asked what they weren't supposed to. If we skipped the climax, what comes next? The book shivered. Pages fluttered like wings. The village grew still. Because the answer wasn't silence this time. It was laughter. From above. Not joyful, not cruel. Something in between. The kind of laugh you hear when a magician drops the final card, and it's your name. The dragon's shape flickered in every puddle. Its laugh rippled through wells, through windows, through wounds. It spoke only once. You don't skip endings, you trade them. And the next morning the tower was gone. In its place, a spiral staircase descending into the dirt, deeper than the roots of any story. The girl stood at its edge, holding the book in one hand and her scissors in the other. She looked back at the villagers. None followed, but none fled. She descended. Each step clicked like a typewriter key, and above, the sky began to erase itself, one sentence at a time. It wasn't dramatic. The sky didn't explode. It unwrote itself the way a dream dissolves when the alarm clock whispers you back into your body. First, the clouds forgot to be shapes. Then the sun, unsure of its role, dimmed to a flicker and vanished like a skipped footnote. Birds no longer flew. They hung, motionless, uncertain whether they were metaphors or simply scenery. Below, the girl descended. The staircase spiraled downward with impossible geometry. It widened and narrowed unpredictably. Some steps echoed, others consumed sound entirely. The walls weren't stone, they were parchment, pages stitched tight, covered in glyphs she couldn't read but understood. Words from earlier drafts, mistakes, warnings, apologies. And somewhere above, the village simply paused. Time hesitated. Not stopped, just stalled. Because something fundamental was missing. The villagers began to notice holes, not in the ground, in memory. A father who remembered raising a son now couldn't picture his face. A baker swore she'd once had a sister, but the house next door had always been empty. Whole conversations flickered in and out of coherence. People began writing their names on their arms in charcoal, terrified they'd forget the curve of their own signatures. They didn't blame the girl, they needed her to succeed, even if none of them could agree on what success meant anymore. The spiral staircase grew colder, not from temperature, but from meaning. The deeper she went, the less real everything became. Her footsteps left no sound. Her breath fogged against nothing. Her hands tingled, as if she were touching the outline of something that hadn't yet decided to exist. The book grew lighter, the scissors heavier. Then she reached the door. No hinges, no handle, just a boundary, a shimmering line like heat above asphalt. She stepped through and found herself in a room with no walls, only pages, floating, endless. Each one showed a version of the village, some thriving, some dying, some on fire, some frozen in amber, some too strange to name, where people wore sentences instead of clothes and buildings breathed like lungs. In the centre, a desk. At the desk, a girl. Not her, not exactly, but close enough to make her jaw tighten. The other looked up and smiled, and it was her smile, crooked, tired, laced with regret. "I've been expecting the next one," she said. The girl didn't answer. She set the book down on the desk. The other didn't touch it. "You think this is the rewrite?" she said. "But it's not. It's the reconciliation." The girl blinked. "Of what?" "Of all the versions you abandoned." Behind them, the pages began to turn. Thousands, millions, every choice, every scene, every character she trimmed or changed or sacrificed to make the plot tighter. "I had to," she whispered. "No," the other said. "You chose to." The room trembled. Far above, the village began to fragment. Streets cracked open to reveal sentences. Doors collapsed into conjunctions. Names peeled off of people, like dried skin. The villagers didn't scream. They started narrating, desperately, trying to remember who they were by saying it out loud. "I was a mother. I built the chapel. I loved him before he forgot. I died 3 rewrites ago." The other stood, walked to the girl, took her hand, and placed it on the book. "You don't get to skip endings," she said again. "You get to choose them." The scissors pulsed in her palm. The spiral behind her eyes tightened, and she realized this wasn't the descent. This was the mirror. And in the mirror, stories bled backward. The girl stared at the other, herself but not. A draft left on the cutting room floor. A voice trimmed to make space for silence. This version of her didn't blink, didn't flinch, just watched, as if she were waiting for the next edit and daring her to cut again. Around them, the floating pages flickered with urgency. One glowed red, another hissed smoke. A third chanted her name in a dialect that tasted like dirt and ink. She stepped closer to the desk. The book sat between them, closed, but trembling like an animal that remembered teeth. "You wrote us into this," the other said, "not out of cruelty, out of convenience. You needed sacrifice to raise the stakes. You needed silence to sound profound." The girl's hands curled. "You were wrong," she said. "I didn't need you gone. I needed you forgotten." That hurt more than screaming. The other smiled, tragic and sharp. "Then do it again. Edit me." You have the scissors. The scissors pulsed. Their weight made the floor beneath her feet bow slightly. A blade that could excise memory from matter. That could reduce regret to ellipses. She could end this, cleanly. Like slicing the end of a rope too frayed to hold weight. The book was hers. The author's blade in her hand. A god-tier delete key. But the room, if it was a room, began to crack. Not physically, tonally. The metaphors broke first, then the metaphysics, logic unwound. Her thoughts became subtitles in someone else's language. The book opened on its own, pages rifling until one stopped her cold. Her name, written in 1,000 tenses, not just what she'd done, but what she'd almost done. The betrayals she'd nearly committed, the mercy she had withheld, the lies she told herself just to sleep through the night. Don't choose silence again, the other whispered. We're not echoes, we're revisions. You erase us, you erase the meaning. The girl's hand trembled, and she dropped the scissors. They fell, slow and loud, landing with a thud that echoed up through the staircase and into the village above. Somewhere, a child forgot what fear tasted like. Somewhere else, an old man remembered his mother's voice and wept into his bread. The other breathed in, finally, and smiled, real this time. You chose to remember. The pages around them paused. The glowing stopped. The hissing softened. The book closed, but no longer resisted. It waited, respectfully, like a candle unlit but ready. The spiral behind the girl's eyes loosened. Not gone, just quieter. You're not done, the other said, stepping back into the mirror. No, the girl agreed, but I'm writing with you now. The mirror rippled. Not like water, like reflection deciding to change its mind. And then she was alone, but not empty. She lifted the book again. Lighter, not because it had less weight, but because it was no longer only hers to carry. The staircase behind her was gone. Only pages remained. She stepped forward, walking across stories like stones in a stream. Each one whispered, "We're still here." Back in the village, the sky rewrote itself. Lines of light carved new constellations, paragraphs across the firmament. No sun, just footnotes made of flame, slowly illuminating what had been missing all along. Not a climax, a collaboration. And the villagers? They stood at the edge of their own edits, holding hands with their contradictions, whispering, "Let us be rewritten, but not erased," because something darker was coming. And this time, they would face it as a chorus. But choruses don't speak with one voice. They collide, they contradict, they echo truths too messy for solos. And that was the beauty of it. The village, once terrified of deviation, now overflowed with overlapping versions. One elder insisted the chapel had always been underground. Another swore the book was just a diary that got out of hand. A child spoke in riddles that made adults sob without knowing why. And no one corrected anyone, because maybe they were all right, or all necessary. Above them, the rewritten sky shifted into a spiral galaxy of footnotes and addendums. Stars no longer twinkled. They typed, blinking out edits with every shimmer. The constellations formed narrative arcs. The moon developed margins. The villagers laid on their backs at night, reading the stars like a shared rough draft. But the girl wasn't among them. She was beneath them, still walking across pages, pages that now whispered names of those who'd been deleted. Her foot brushed one, and the name Mira rose like heat from ink. She knelt, pressed her fingers to it, and for a second she was in Mira's house again, the one with the scented wax and the thread that hummed like bees when pulled taut. Mira sat at her loom, but the threads she wove were sentences, half-formed, curling with potential. "You remember," Mira said softly. "I tried not to," the girl replied. "And how did that work out for you?" Not cruel, just curious. The loom spun on, and the girl stood. "I need to know what's coming." "You do," Mira agreed, "but knowing isn't the same as understanding." And just like that, she was gone again. Or maybe the girl had turned the page. She walked. Below her, the book continued. its spine stretched into the distance, a long, winding record of every version, every sin, every almost miracle. She paused at one page where her own face had been replaced by a spiral, another where her hands were made of ink, another where she never existed, but the scissors still did. And then a new page appeared. Blank, truly blank, not unwritten, unwritable. The girl hesitated, because this was different. This wasn't a moment waiting to happen. This was a hole, a void, a deliberate absence. It pulsed gently, not inviting, daring, as if to say, go ahead, try to explain this. She stepped on it. The world around her blinked, and she was back in the village. But not. Everyone stood frozen, mid-laugh, mid-cry, mid-confession, as if paused by a director between takes. The air smelled of parchment and lightning. The spiral tower was rebuilt, but now made of sound. You couldn't see it unless you listened. Every footstep echoed in reverse, and standing at its summit was the editor. Again, or maybe for the first time. He held a single word in his hands. It writhed like a living thing. He looked down at her, eyes heavy with authorial exhaustion, and said, "This is the one you refuse to write." The girl approached. The words shifted form. Sometimes a name, sometimes a question, sometimes just the sound you make when you finally admit you're afraid. "I didn't have the voice," she whispered. "You still don't," the editor said, "but you have others now." And that was the moment the villagers moved again. Together. They stepped toward the tower, their voices overlapping, harmonizing into a chord that had never existed before. Not a hymn, not a chant, a rewrite, and the editor finally smiled. But not with satisfaction, with surrender. But that wasn't even the worst part, because what the editor handed her wasn't just the unwritable word, it was her reflection, encoded into language, a secret she'd buried so deep. Even the mirror flinched when it saw it. The word shimmered, then shifted into a shape too slippery for grammar, somewhere between mercy and mistake. And she recognised it. It was the story she'd refused to tell, the one where she was the monster. Not metaphorically, not as a symbol, literally. The draft where her scissors didn't cut scenes, they cut people. Where her edits were executions, where the spiral didn't whisper, it screamed orders in her voice. And worse, and the villagers loved her for it. They chanted her name, built the tower in her honour, worshipped her as the first rewrite. And she fed the book their names, one by one. Efficient, logical, beautiful. She dropped the word. It hit the ground with a sound like cracking bone. The tower shook. Villagers clutched their heads as echoes from the discarded draft flooded their skulls. One screamed in a voice not his own. Another laughed through tears, muttering, "We chose this, again." And the editor? He didn't flinch. He only whispered, "It wasn't a dream. It was a decision." That's when she understood the twist. There wasn't one spiral. There were layers. And at the centre of each was her again and again, choosing control over chaos, deleting dissent, pruning pain, all for clarity, all for structure, all to make the story work. And every time, the book rewarded her with silence, with compliance, with that precious, awful word, closure. She staggered back, but something darker was coming. Not from the book, from the villagers. Their hands began to glow, each one holding fragments of their erased selves. One woman clutched a version of her child who never survived birth. A man held the eyes he lost in a fire that never happened. Even the children bore echoes of timelines they'd never lived, wearing expressions too old for their faces. The editor nodded. "They remember, because you let them." The girl sank to her knees. Tears traced new lines down her cheeks, ink black, curling like rejected sentences. "I thought I was fixing it," she said. "I thought I was helping." "You were," he said, "just not in the way you wanted." She looked up. "Then what do I do now?" And the editor, who'd never once touched her, reached down. Not to lift her, to offer the scissors. But this time, reversed. The blades turned inward. a tool not for cutting others, but for opening herself. "If you want to end the spiral," he said, "you have to unwrite the author." She froze, because she knew what that meant. Not death, not erasure, responsibility, to take back everything she excised, to stitch it into her skin, to walk forward not as the editor of their pain, but its witness. The book cracked open behind her. A wind of discarded drafts roared. Pages howled like wolves. She took the scissors, and the villagers stepped forward. Not to stop her, to join her. One by one they pressed their fragments into her body. A memory in the palm, a regret in the ribs, a betrayal stitched into her back. She cried out, not from pain but from weight, and then from behind the wind a familiar voice whispered, and with that she opened herself, and bled, a new beginning. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what the blood wrote, because it didn't stain, it composed. Across the book's open pages her blood didn't pool, it formed paragraphs. It wrote in red what had been lost in black. Words long silenced flowed again, not from lips, but from veins. The villagers didn't cry out, they read, with wide eyes, with trembling hands, with recognition so sharp it left bruises on the soul. One line at a time, they began to remember their true origins. They weren't characters, they weren't props, they were authors, all of them. Each had written a part of this village, this myth, this spiral, but she, girl with the scissors, girl with the book, had edited them into silence, for pacing, for cohesion, for symmetry, for control. The narrative had become cleaner, tighter, more digestible, but it had also become a lie. Now the lie was bleeding out in reverse. Each villager stepped forward and pressed their palm to a page. The book writhed, not in protest, in release, as if finally permitted to breathe again. The tower of sound that loomed above began to crumble, not violently, but in slow musical collapse, like an orchestra folding into a single final chord that refuses to resolve. The editor stood at the base, eyes closed, arms open, letting the collapse wash over him. He didn't run, he didn't rewrite, he listened, and from the dust a figure emerged, not the girl, something after her, a being sewn from every fragment she'd absorbed. Her eyes, yes, but rimmed with the gaze of thousands. Her voice, yes, but layered with accents and dialects from stories cut too soon. She carried no scissors, no book, no author's tools, only a pen. It dripped gold and ash. The villagers gathered, forming a circle, the kind used in old stories for summoning, for sentencing, for healing. And then they spoke, together. A chorus not of agreement, but of memory. I was erased. I was rewritten. I was improved until I vanished. I forgive you. I don't. I'm not ready. I'm still here. The pen trembled in her hand. The spiral above them began to slow. Not stop, but breathe, for the first time in 1,000 pages. Because the spiral, it turned out, wasn't a trap. It was a heartbeat. And for the first time, it wasn't skipping. She stepped forward and knelt. Not in surrender, in invitation. She placed the pen in the centre of the circle. No one took it at first, but then a child stepped forward. Barefoot, mud-smeared, smiling like a secret. She picked up the pen and asked, "Can I draw?" And everyone, every single villager, answered at once, yes. With that the child began to sketch, not in the book, on the ground, a new village, not perfect, not symmetrical, alive. And in that moment, the sky didn't just rewrite itself. It laughed, soft and wild and free. But even then, something lingered. Because beneath the drawing, beneath the soil, beneath the memory, the scissors remained, closed, dormant, but watching. They say stories end. But do they? Or do we just stop telling them out loud? The scissors never blinked, never moved, but somehow they were closer now, not buried, just forgotten with intent. The way we forget war after a holiday, or grief after a song. They rested beneath the child's drawing, silent, clean, waiting, because endings lie, and tools remember. Above them, the sky finally stilled. Not blank, just paused. Like a reader halfway through a sentence, afraid to turn the page because they already know how it feels. The villagers breathed again, but slower, measured. The kind of breath you take when you've survived, but not healed. The new village took shape quickly, not from blueprints, from memory, from longing, from the messy glue of shared contradiction. Homes grew crooked on purpose, paths forked with no destination. A well whispered different truths depending who drank from it. And no one dared build a tower, not anymore. They wrote their stories in chalk on the walls. No edits allowed, no margins for improvement. Just raw, beautiful chaos in full view. But sometimes, at night, one or two would wander to where the scissors were buried. They didn't dig. They just stood, remembered. Maybe it was reverence, maybe it was fear, maybe both, because some part of them still asked, what if it goes wrong again? What if a new editor is born? What if the child with the pen grows teeth? What if we need the spiral? The girl, what was left of her, never returned. Not fully, but echoes of her lingered. A turn of phrase in a dream. A flash of ink in the corner of someone's eye. Sometimes the wind hissed with her voice. Leave the scissors where they are. But not everyone listened, and one day, inevitably, someone did unearth them. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even noticed at first. A small child, curious, digging. He found metal, sharp, familiar. He smiled, and the spiral turned, just a little. Because maybe the point was never to end the story. Maybe the point was to remember that no ending is safe, no tool stays buried forever. No narrative, no matter how redemptive, is immune to relapse. So they watched. The villagers, the stars, the pages, you. And maybe the next rewrite won't be a purge. Maybe it'll be an addition. A thread not trimmed but tangled. A story that doesn't end but haunts. After all, if even gods can be edited, what does that say about us?